What we're going to do this morning is engage in a panel discussion, but really a whole group discussion. This is why you see the microphones on the microphone stands around the room. I would like to nurture a kind of as much of a rapid fire type of conversation as possible. So when I say that, what I mean is when you are speaking, whether you're up here or down there at a microphone, that you keep your comments brief and pointed, but not rude. Okay. Brief and pointed, but not rude. And what I'm going to do is try and guide us along with some questions for thought. And then if you all want to go a different way other than the questions that I pose, then feel free to do that. All right? I do want to recognize that for the Christians in the room, today is Palm Sunday, and it marks the beginning of our Holy Week. Palm Sunday being the day when we Christians remember that our Jesus rode into Jerusalem in a humble way as an expression of the humility of God. At least this is how I see it. The humility of God going forward in front of us for our sakes. So this is the beginning of the Christian Holy Week, and Easter is next Sunday with Good Friday interceding on Friday. So it is a busy week for many of those who are clergy, and I'm delighted that I don't have a local church at this point in my life, although I remember Christmas and Holy Week, those are just busy times and you're exhausted at the end of it. I'm glad to be able to just participate now. But please remember our Christian brothers and sisters as Holy Week commences today with Palm Sunday. So y'all ready? All right, are you fired up? You have enough caffeine in your system? You ready? You don't have enough caffeine in your system? I did lie to you yesterday. I'm sorry about that, but there is, in fact, fresh coffee over there. Avoid the stuff on the right. It won't get you anywhere. It's decaf. Stuff on the left is for real. Well, let's begin with, I don't really have a question so much as a statement that I feel like has been raised in various kinds of ways in the context of interfaith dialogue and conversation on campus and the nature of the college campus today, and that is bringing into question belief itself. So in a very real way, God is in question, or the divine is in question on college campuses. Is that true or not true? Who wants to wade into that?
That's for you.
Yeah. Oh, first, as you speak up here, introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, by the way. I'm Brian. I'm here at Vanderbilt. I'm a graduate student doing my PhD in biology. And I'm sorry?
No,
okay.
I'm a biology major, too.
Oh, cool.
I am, too. Really?
So as far as the question of whether or not God himself is in question, from my point of view, I would say yes, because I'm here also representing the Secular Student Alliance. And although I grew up Christian, I'm currently an atheist. And so I would say just in an empirical way, yes, God is in question because there are people who you can talk to who question the existence of God. I don't know if I can elaborate more than that, really, without follow-up questions.
I would say yes. On college campuses, God is very much in question. My experience, I'm Veronica. I'm from Columbia College in South Carolina. And more I have interactions with people who really question the validity of the Christian faith, whether there is a God, whether Christianity is in fact a peaceful religion. I've encountered a lot of people who have lost their faith in God because of negative experiences with people who identify as faithful people, whether they are Christian or of other faiths. So I think God is very much in question on college campuses, more the idea of whether the practices of Christianity are even realistic at this point in our society with everything that's going on in the world today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Monica Mahanti, and I'm from Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia. And to answer the question, is the divine in question on college campuses? I think that one thing that is interesting to note, especially on our college campus, is maybe necessarily God himself, herself, itself is not in question, but rather the practices and traditions that we have are in question. So how do those practices and traditions how do we do that in the modern day, when there's social media or we have a very diverse religious campus? How do we practice those things? And if there needs to be change to those practices, how does that look like? And I think, especially on our college campus, that's what we see a lot of is these practices. I don't understand why I'm doing it or what I'm doing it for, but how can I shape this to fit my needs?
Hi, everyone.
You got something? No?
Well, I would just say direct and
Yeah.
not rude. Or
You can be rude if you need to be.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm Noah. I'm from Interfaith Youth Corps. I guess I would just point out the college campus doesn't exist. There are 2,800 four-year residential colleges in North America, and I imagine you'll find very different experiences at George Fox University, which is a CCCU school, than you will at Amherst, where I was last week. So I think I wonder the utility of speaking of the college campus in the aggregate as opposed to disaggregating what's going on in different campuses. I would also say, as the Jacobsons have done in their sort of study of religion and higher education in No Longer Invisible, and it seems like there might be some corollaries to what I haven't read Wells chapter 1, chapter 2, but they talk about pluriform religion as the dominant mode now, where we used to have sort of like secularity and religion, and near the twain shall meet, it's all sort of brackish now, right? You have this mix that's going on. So if you're coming from saltwater, brackish seems like God is in question. And if you're coming from freshwater, brackish seems like God is everywhere. So I think it's all relative to what your norm is and where you're coming from.
Hello, I'm Mark Forrester, Chaplain Director of Religious Life at Vanderbilt, and I think what I would go by, I agree with Noah that you really have to look very, specifically at your own context, and it is a pluriform world of higher ed where the religious and spiritual ethos changes from location to location. At Vanderbilt, though, we do look at our basic quality of life survey every spring with our incoming freshman class of 1,600 students, and it aligns fairly well with the Pew Research data in that most students do at least identify as religious in some way, but that doesn't mean at all what it is that they are grappling with from day one as a first-year student until they reach commencement 4 years later. And so that's why we have our Interfaith Council, because I do believe, if anything, that for a lot of students at least, if they do self-identify as a theist or some sort of believer, or come from some kind of tradition, that their static and received understandings enter into a more dynamic phase if they're really grappling with it at all. So I think that it's a time of life, and hopefully it extends beyond those 4 years. I think for many it does, in which the idea of God is unmoored from its traditional foundation somewhat. Also, I'd like to say that I was told I'm good. I've came back to the Methodist fold after many years, but I was told, especially if I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, that I would lose my religion, and of course I did. But then I reclaimed it as my own.
That's the point.
And so I would say that that's true also for undergraduates. That the students that come from very traditional conservative households, in particular, whether it be Christian, Jewish, whatnot. a lot of times I'll find these students that come, in from just the opposite kind of life situation where maybe they were raised in a nominal kind of way. They went to school, maybe they were bar mitzvahed, but they, really did not engage their faith in any active way growing up. And then they come to Vanderbilt, and I found especially with our Jewish students, they're drawn to Chabad, are very, very interested in sort of the mystic dimension of their faith. I'm not saying that that's where they end up, but I just think it's a very interesting time of kind of educational exploration, and oftentimes it does stick as an authenticating faith rather than one that's just been received.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Say who you are.
Oh, sorry.
After you.
Oh, sorry. I'm Hershey. I'm a senior at Vanderbilt, and I would say that in general, college is just a time of questioning. So if you're, don't have as strong a faith background, you're kind of interested in the other side. What are people that have a lot of faith? How do they live? How do they think? And then college just has lots of organizations, so it's easy to join. And then on the flip side, if you have a really strong faith, it's really easy to meet people that question that, and so you kind of question that. So at least for me in general, all the values that I had growing up, I always kind of meeting different types of people, taking different classes, learning new things. I just kind of tend to question, kind of everything in a certain way. So if you have God, you question it. If you don't, maybe you also question that as well.
Yeah, I was wondering whether what is being questioned is the way in which different religions have understood God, or the doctrines, etc., that go with that, or it is something more profound and much deeper about where there is something beyond. Is it a secular understanding of the world, secularized understanding of the world, that there is nothing beyond, there is nothing to which we have to be accountable for, this life is what it's all about? So are we in the campuses facing a context in which all that signified by the word God, there is some depth to life, there is meaning to life, purpose to life, or whatever word we use, the ultimate concerns, are that itself coming under attack, and we having a much more secular understanding of life itself? Or are we rejecting what we have been taught as God and religion and all that as outmoded and is not suitable for us? It will be interesting to see where the campuses are going.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Nabal Abdu, and I am from Columbia College in Columbia, South Carolina. I would like to say that, as fellow speakers have already said here, college is a time of really trying to find out who you are. I mean, college is not in the sense, you're really supposed to try to understand what your values are, or what you want to, or who you want to become. Because at the same time, some people, speaking just personally for myself, I grew up with values and going back to Islam, and actually when I got into college, it actually strengthened. But that's not the same for everybody. Instead, some people, they kind of question, in a sense, I've had these set values, and I've gone into being in this household that had these set of values. But I go to college and I see that there's so many different people in terms of ethnic diversity or religious diversity. And I'm trying to find out who I am and what actually my place is, not only in college, but what it will be in terms of society. So it's a lot that people can go through. Some people may necessarily think it is a negative if they do start questioning God. But sometimes if people end up, necessarily if they had a faith before and they kind of steer away from that and they learn, they actually may come to that faith even stronger. But even if you didn't have, even if you didn't have a faith, or, or let's say you grew up with a faith and you decide not to, most of the time, there's a lot of moral codes that go for people who don't even have a faith. So it depends, but that's it.
Any thoughts from out there? You got to get a microphone.
I can yell loud.
Well, we got to capture it. If it's not on the microphone, we don't capture it in the video.
Okay, sure.
So that's why we have the mics. And you can just hand them around. There's 3 of them out there.
This will be interesting because I was going to read what I have a quote from here. Okay. Our classrooms furnish an arena which brutish doctrine tears to pieces the religious faith of young men and young women. And that was said 100 years ago by William Jennings Bryan, presidential candidate, who, after being rejected by the voters, he blamed colleges for his losses, in particular singling out the University of Wisconsin for that. However, a PRRI poll taken last year showed that 80% of people who basically leave the church, become unaffiliated, do so before the age of 18.
All right. So it's not the college's fault.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with what you're saying. It's not a question. You probably should be doing that. It's overstated to blame them.
I guess I'm Rita Agarwal. I'm also a graduate student at Vanderbilt, but I'm also a physician practicing and part of the Interfaith Council in Rutherford County and some in Davidson County. So what my experience has been going to different religious organizations and their place of worship, as well as reading the original thought which started the religion, I don't think anybody questions. Well, I think I should go backward and say, the question I would say is, what is the definition of God? If the definition is to you all that there's a human being or a being high up there controlling everything, yes, it's in question. Okay. But if it is God's definition to, you grow the definition of God as you evolve in your journey. If the question is, what are those God ideals? If God is defined by ideals, way of living, a code of living, nobody questions that. That is universal. Whether you practice or not, they all would like that in the other person with whom you're interacting. Of course, we forget our own behavior and our own practices when we get upset and angry. But yes, that is universal, accepted definition if you consider God as ideals. Now, if you consider also God as an energy that's going around you, again, there is an atheist and there is a theist. That word energy, again, you're defining it as an entity. So I think I wanted to straighten that. There are different definitions of God as you evolve in every theology of religion. And I wanted to point that there are these differences in what you consider God is.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your comments. And I appreciated the emphasis on college being a time to find yourself or authenticate your religious tradition, to own it for yourself. And I started to think especially about Noah's comment where we don't want to make a generalization about the college campus, but I want to respond with this kind of proposal of a regulative ideal for college campuses. And I was thinking about how, especially in light of the comment about people lose their faith before 18, even before they get to college, because it's something like a family member dies or something like this, instead of arguments for and against the existence of God or something like that. And so I'm wondering if we can think of an ideal for college campuses where the way in which people can authenticate their faith or find themselves in the classroom, coming as the educator, the classroom dimension, to think of classrooms as labs for formulating questions and their precision and formulating explanatory theories that clarify the authenticating process or clarify finding yourself in ways that aren't available with these trauma experiences or things like that. So like an ideal for the classroom, I would hope, and maybe also in student life, would be these proposals for explanatory systems by which we can clarify our processes of self-development or something like that.
Thank you.
In an interreligious conversation, it seems important to flag the fact that there are religious traditions without God. And so I returned to Noah's question last night: how would our interfaith work look different if it didn't begin within Christianity? So what if we began within Buddhism, for instance? This sort of God obsession would look different. So I just wanted to flag that.
Is that middle mic turned on? Can you hear it back there?
So just listening to the process, I always come back to like the ground and try to describe what's happening rather than sort of look for big picture sort of things out there or even in our minds. And so I guess my observation and my question sort of turns back to this. I mean, you're asking, is there a kind of crisis about sort of religious belief or sort of religious faith or sort of what's happening on campuses? And I like the idea that we sort of keep them, we don't sort of essentialize all of them, that there's going to be differences across all those. But it seems to me we're really talking about three different institutions. We're talking about colleges as an institution and how they maintain and what they do. We're talking about religious institutions and how it is that they support the people that join them or sort of participate in them. And the other one that's come up consistently from the students has been your families as institutions. And so there's an intersection of those three institutions. And I guess I'd pose the question a little bit different. Are we, and I'm interested in the relationship then between campuses, families, religious institutions, or whatever other institutions might be out there that we need to build and maintain. Are we just facing a crisis or a loss of faith in institutions and in how we sort of decide how to build those regulations or sort of build those values or construct those together? Do we just not believe in those things anymore? I guess that's another way to couch the question in a sort of more, I guess, grounded way for me.
Thank you. A loss of faith in institutions comes the question. Well, that leads me to the second question, which is actually one that we received via email when we were advertising this event. And I've cleaned it up a little bit and made it one question. There was no nasty words in there, but the essence of the question was, should United Methodist-related colleges promote Christianity and, in a sense, be more evangelical, creating new Christians? So that was kind of my boiling down of the question that was put to us. And it was put to us not like legitimately asking the question, but why are you doing this? Why is the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry bringing people together to have conversations on interfaith grounds with Methodist Church money when perhaps we should spend that money on creating new Methodists rather than generating opportunities for understanding? So should church-related schools be evangelical in their focus? Should faith-related institutions have an evangelical, if you will, perspective? And this, I can't remember, I think it was, we had the three philosophers up here, and one of you was kind of raising that question. Yeah, I think it was you. Well, you'll take the blame for that? So what do you think of that? Should church-related institutions of higher education have an evangelical focus?
This is something that I've struggled with a lot recently personally. We are called as, Christians are called to disciple for Christ and to bring people to the Christian faith. And so then where does that stand when we're focusing more on understanding rather than bringing people to Christ. And Nabal and I were actually just discussing this yesterday, and in the Muslim faith, they believe that no one should be forced to convert. It should be a very willing conversion, a genuine conversion that is from the heart rather than from feeling obligated or pressured to convert. And my stance as a Christian on discipling and whether we should be bringing people to Christ with this money or encouraging interfaith dialogue is that if we are living our lives and behaving as Christ would have us behave, those conversions would come willingly if they are meant to happen. And if not, our job is to love. We are to love one another and be at peace with one another rather than trying to forcibly move someone from their own faithful stance.
So let me do you have something you want to say to that? Yeah, go ahead.
To your initial question.
Yeah.
It sounds like, well, I'm talking to our colleagues right here. Laura K. McMasters, Martin Methodist, hour south of here. It sounds like it's sad that they do not acknowledge the United Methodist social principles, which, for those of you who are not United Methodist, in our social principles, it's called the rights of religious minorities, saying that all should have a place to practice their faith and be free from legal, political, or economic restrictions. And so as chaplain at Martin Methodist College, every time we have a group of prospective students on campus, I get my 2 minutes to step up and say, hey, yes, we are United Methodist related. You do not have to be United Methodist to be active on our campus. You're not required to go to chapel. Yes, I am a United Methodist clergy person. And because we are United Methodist, we will walk alongside you, whatever your faith tradition may be. And no, I don't have all the answers, but I will help you work through those. So, my perspective as a United Methodist is, thank God we're doing this, because if we're going to coexist and improve the quality of life, transform the quality of life on this world for the better, we need to be able to have these conversations and live together peacefully.
Thank you. So I'm going to add some complexity to the question. If you think of schools like Harvard and Princeton and Vanderbilt University across the street, these are schools that would identify themselves as non-sectarian. Yet their founding is a religious founding. So what about those non-sectarian campuses like Vanderbilt with religious roots that still have, affiliated with the university, largely Christian divinity schools training largely Christian clergy? I'm looking at Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say that Vanderbilt is not currently a Methodist institution, but we have played one on TV. No, we lost control. The Methodist Church lost control of Vanderbilt in 1913. And from that time forward has been unapologetically non-sectarian. But as I get back to the original question about whether or not there can be an evangelical witness at a church-related college and or even a non-sectarian school, I would first ask, how do we define evangelism? If it is kind of a wanton form of proselytizing people, getting scalps in the name of Jesus, then no, that is not the way to even bear witness in any way with integrity as a Christian or as any other kind of believer. But if we define evangelism as radical hospitality, which I think for Christians is certainly centered in the Eucharist, in the table that is open to all, but beyond that, in terms of reaching out to the neighbor, to the other. And so I think in that regard, we can be just exuberantly hospitable and then bear witness to our faith in that interchange. I think it's in the Jacobson book that they mention how that, and I don't know if this is still the case, but that in terms of the per capita growth of Muslim students on any American campus, that one of the largest growing campuses with the Muslim population is Brigham Young University, which is unapologetically Latter-day Saint. They have bent over backwards to be a host to the religious other, even though they are very clear about the beliefs and their sense of theological mission that keeps them there. So I think you can do both, but I think it's not so much what you believe, but how you believe it and how you express it and what you lead with. And I think to lead with hospitality and kindness is where you start.
Thank you.
If I could say a couple words real quick. I very strongly believe that what you believe is not nearly as important as why you believe it. And I just said I believe that, so I guess what difference does it make if I can't defend that? But maybe we can get to that later if you're curious. But in any case, while the United Methodist Church can do what it wants with its money, as far as promoting more evangelism versus more, interfaith discussions that don't necessarily have an evangelistic goal, that is something that I think is valuable because it puts the focus of the conversation on how do we navigate rather than what is the goal that we're navigating towards. If your mind is operating according to a reliable truth-seeking algorithm, then that's something that you should be able to have confidence in regardless of where it leads you, basically. The whole idea of following the evidence where it leads rather than leading the evidence toward a preferred conclusion. And so that's something that I think unites everybody, whether you come from a faith tradition or not, whether you are a theist or an atheist. That's the one thing that I think kind of unites all of us and that we all share in common is our interest in the truth and our interest in discussing, what's true about this reality that we inhabit. So that's something, of course, by being up here, I suppose you are kind of by extension asking the question to a non-believer of, should we be making more believers? But if the focus of the question or if the focus of the conversation is on how do we navigate reality and what are the best methods for leading us towards conclusions, then that is kind of what I see here. Then I think that's more important than just what is the goal that we're trying to reach. I don't know if that helps or not.
I think in a way it's the original question was and we could take it as an interfaith question. I am not an evangelical Christian, but there are evangelical Christians who believe that their purpose is to convert other people, right? To proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and the salvation of God, and that people would confess that, and that's the goal. And there are evangelical Christians on Vanderbilt University's campus. There are evangelical Christians on many campuses who they hold that. That's part of their faith identity. So how do we, if we're taking this as an interfaith question, how do we take care of people with that viewpoint while we're thinking broadly about the interfaith conversation? Did you have a thought on that, or anybody up here? Elizabeth?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I was thinking of the same thing in a different manner, how we have people who are in the process of converting people towards Christianity in our campuses, and the vision they have of Christianity seems counter to us as United Methodists. And having an evangelical slant on the interfaith work, in that here is a vision of Christianity that welcomes to dialogue a variety of people, is something to offer a generation that is very skeptical that we have anything to offer. And so I would say we need to be evangelical of this work of interfaith within our Methodist tradition, and offer a different viewpoint of what Christianity can be, and that has worth.
Thank you.
I wanted to go back to the comment about people losing faith in their institutions, and how you clarified it too. But the institution I want to ask about in relationship to your question is not should Methodists be spending money on interfaith or converting more. It's that should religious colleges, religiously affiliated colleges, be accredited and recognized as legitimate colleges, because that the institution that I'm interested in is the accrediting agency that recognizes colleges as colleges and not something else. And so when, maybe we should get Interfaith Youth Corps, we could like interject into accrediting agencies to say, in order to be a college, it has to be interfaith or something like that. I don't know. I'm interested.
I'm not a Hindu. I'm not a Christian. I'm a Hindu. So, but being part of the interfaith, I would say to the evangelist and the other who have institutions that are religion-based is, well, let's go back and think that when the Christianity was started, the word Christianity came much later. The prophets or Lord Jesus or in the Muslims, what were those fundamental values or principles that brought that group together and be as a force that they wanted to propagate that value and that philosophy initially, while they defended themselves with the oppressors of that philosophy, if you go back to history. So if there's a religion-based institution, obviously history shows that you either convert out of fear and force, or you convert because somebody in that religion or faith did something that made a big difference in their life. And then you convert. And so the best path, obviously, is, even if after fear you change, you're going to change back. You're not going to stay in that mode of religion. But if you do it out of love and the values, you're going to sustain in that belief. So obviously the path has to be inclusive, interfaith, so that in that interfaith dialogue, the person will have a journey that, the evangelists are so broad-minded, so loving, so inclusive. What's wrong to be an evangelist? What's wrong to be an United Methodist? What's wrong to be, in our Hindus, there are these Shaivites and there are these Vishnus believers. So what's wrong being in that? So there are those questions even in Hinduism, as I know in every other religion. So I would say to evangelists, method is by being more inclusive and let that person see and then convert if that's their goal. Every religion has that goal, by the way, that even in Hinduism, that it's your fundamental goal to have more like you. If I put it in easy words, is more like you so that there is less conflict.
Thank you.
Now, as much as we believe, because I believe we're gathered here because we believe everyone has the freedom of practicing whatever religion they want, and as much as it came up to me a little bit like it was a little negative that the evangelists thought of converting people, and as much as each of us has the right to practice the religion, I believe that those evangelists also have the right to think strongly in converting people. And then at the same time, what is interfaith and what are they questioning interfaith? That's when I have a conflict with that, because at the very least, to my understanding, interfaith is, at least what we're doing, is to just come together on a common ground and unity and try to find peace and understanding. I did not think that there is any purpose of converting each other or switching religion or having a winning religion behind all this, or a winning belief. But just in case they pick, let's say the Methodist Church, pick evangelism, at the very least, before you engage in evangelism, I believe there need to be an understanding of what are the others and their concept. I think it's very sad that many of us, or many of the evangelist people, they want to convert without even understanding. They want people to testify and say that, yes, I believe in Jesus Christ, without even trying to know where they come from. So to the very least, if the Methodist Church should invest in this interfaith convention, yes. Because at least if you want to convert them, let's go with your belief, you need to understand first about the other, understand where they come from, and trying to find a common ground before you move forward. So I respect the freedom of everyone to practice whatever religion or belief they have, but yes, if you're questioning if the Methodist Church should invest in this kind of activities, then definitely yes. Before you convert, we need to understand in depth where others are coming from.
Thank you very much. Yes.
So I'm Muslim, and I go to Columbia College. And Columbia College does have the United Methodist affiliation. But going to Columbia College, even when I was invited for Scholars Day, I already knew from the vibe or kind of understanding the campus dynamics that that it wasn't going to be forced upon me to necessarily have to, I guess, compromise with what I necessarily believe in terms of like what the campus believes in. And that hasn't been the case for me in my experience there. But I will say in terms of, I've had come across a few evangelical Christians on campus, and I do recall distinctly in my first year that there was a student, she was very resistant towards me because I wear the hijab, so it's more obvious in terms of if you were Muslim or not. So I took this strategy on, and I was like, initially I said, well, why is she kind of against me, or I didn't do anything to her. This is the first time I ever met her. And I eventually found, that I was her kind of first exposure, and she had very strong beliefs, and I guess I didn't necessarily fit in with those beliefs. So I decided, I was like, okay, what's the strategy in terms of this? Because I wasn't going to necessarily compromise or wanting her to compromise on her beliefs. I just wanted to say hi to her. So I took upon myself the strategy of saying hi to her every single day, always waving to her and always giving her a warm smile. And eventually, she started opening up to me. She started smiling. She started necessarily asking me, and she started complimenting me on my hijab. And it eventually I wasn't looking to necessarily say, my religion is right compared to yours. That wasn't the goal. The goal was necessarily to basically kind of just be able to be in the room without kind of necessarily looking at me in a weird way. So in terms of that, I think the goal will necessarily be to try to really have students to really understand or to be willing to understand other student perspectives. And a lot of the time because like I said previously before, I'm the first exposure that some of the students at my college has ever had to a Muslim. So I always say, I guess, I'm not, of course, representative of the whole religion. I try to give out as much knowledge as I can if a person is curious. But, a lot of students became more receptive. But in return, I kind of wanted to also figure out, what the background is that they had, whether they were necessarily part of, whether they were a Jehovah's Witness, or whether they were Presbyterian, or whether they didn't even have a faith at all. So Slowly, though, I think that some students can be a little bit more receptive to that. I mean, nobody can force them. It has to come if they're willing to do that. But something as a warm smile and just a hello can really change the student's perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, all of us are here today because we believe in the purpose of interfaith work and dialogue and discussion on our college campuses, or at least we're trying to learn about it more. But I keep thinking about Dr. Patel's speech on our first day when he gave the example of the Inuit and the Eskimo. And with evangelical Christians, do we consider them as an other from the purpose that we are trying to serve? And is that in itself a dangerous thought? Because then we're creating this divide between they have their purpose, which is separate from ours. So how can we, I guess, think of them as, you know, a member of our college community, but they also have every right to do what they're doing?
Mark? You can actually pick that thing up. You all don't have to stand there.
So in 2013, we had our first two students at Oklahoma City University go to an Interfaith Leadership Institute. One was a United Methodist religion major. The other was a biology major who was Muslim. And in their experience there, the United Methodist student saw the Muslim student praying 5 times a day and began to ask himself, why is it my prayer life more important to me? Why isn't my prayer life as important to me as this person's prayer life is to him? And they had dialogue about it. They talked about it. They became very good friends. They became the two students that really helped start our interfaith student work at the university. And when Ibu Patel came to the university, they introduced him, telling this story of this experience that they had. The student who's Muslim went on to go to medical school and do work to help persons who have lack of access to medical care on the West Bank, among other things. The United Methodist student is a United Methodist minister now, and I just got a message that he's starting a church plant in Oklahoma City. He's a better United Methodist because of his experience in interfaith work, and the other students, I think, a better Muslim because of his experience in that work, and they're both involved in transforming the world. And the mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I think some United Methodist money may have been spent on that institute, having our two students go, and I think it was a really good investment.
Thank you. So let me, I want to move in a similar way. I was hoping that we'd kind of head this way. So Dr. Ariaraja, in his talk yesterday, referenced the community, the early Christian community that gave up things that he described as fundamental to who they were. Circumcision and the law. Torah. Circumcision and the law. So my question is, based on that, why should a faithful person, can you somebody let the guy in at the back door? I think he belongs. You got to press that little green button there to the left and he can come in. Why should a faithful person with a given set of practices and beliefs need to give anything up in order to be open to another person with a different set of practices and beliefs?
I think I must answer from my own sort of spiritual autobiographical account of how that speaks to me. I think this also is a reason why a lot of us are in this room and why we work in higher education. Because for us, in our undergraduate and graduate years, it was very formative and reformative. So back to your question, I think for me, when I look at my undergraduate experience, I was a recovering fundamentalist. And so I was really decompressing in a place of deconstruction and decompression. And it wasn't until I was able to let go of a few things that my world started to expand, and I started to see other horizons, even within the the broader, more, and I'll use the word pluriform, expression of my own faith. I look back at the time in my life when I was still clinging as a fundamentalist to certain dogmatic beliefs. And, I used the Bible, as it said, a lot like a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. And,
I like that.
and so as I let go of, these dogmatic certainties, I really saw a dimension of my own faith, and then later the religious other, and that came into play as well. But I think you kind of have to start with self-interrogation before you go to the interrogation of the other. And I don't mean interrogation in a mean kind of way. I mean like just energetic questioning and critical reflection. So I think of Meister Eckhart, who says that spiritual progress, it comes about through a process of subtraction rather than addition. And so I think it's only when we're willing to let go of things that then broader horizons open up for us, and that we also start to see, the hidden treasure in our own tradition that we were blind to, so that we can enter into a conversation with the religious other more meaningfully. I think of Abraham Joshua Heschel's beautiful essay on No Religion is an Island, where he says the most important component of interfaith is faith. And so we have to have gone through a period of self-interrogation before we can meaningfully enter into interfaith conversation, I believe. I mean, I think we can do it in other ways, but I think that's the most meaningful way to move forward.
So I think in interfaith work at the surface, there's, a fundamental contradiction, how many absolute truths are out there, right? In Christianity, you believe that you have certain views about Jesus, and that's not replicated in Judaism or Islam. So at the fundamental level, it seems like it's really hard to have just interfaith dialogue, because there's just fundamental contradictions between all the religions, and all the religions believe, that's what's true, that's what's right. So to have any interfaith dialogue, I feel like, you can still be strong in your belief, but you have to kind of give up this notion that this is the only way that I can think. This is the only way you can think. Otherwise, on the surface, it's just a contradiction.
I think sometimes we might find ourselves resistant to the idea, because some people may necessarily think the way that I believe is right, the way that others believe is wrong. And they necessarily take that belief. So if you have a person who comes from a different belief than you're very resistant towards them. So I know one thing certain is that in terms of my faith, we're taught that you should try to expand your knowledge as much as you can. And knowledge is not limited to just trying to learn more about Islam and continuing to grow in your faith, but it's really about expanding your knowledge, whether it's academically or necessarily learning about people who come from different faiths or people who don't necessarily have a faith. Kind of understanding what it is. And the thing is, too, is that, for me, I just take it that way. I like learning. And the thing is that I feel like the one thing I really love about learning is that learning never stops. It keeps going and going. So, even for myself, I really do want to try to learn more about these necessarily different branches within Christianity per se, or learn more about Judaism or Hinduism. I want to push myself to learn more. And sometimes I think people may think that, if we do that, we necessarily don't believe in our faith anymore, or we don't necessarily have the same ideals. But if anything, learning more, it might actually help reaffirm that or make you stronger within your faith in terms of being willing to learn more and expand more. So.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Ken Purcell from the University of Virginia College at Wise. I kind of want to question your question. As I understand, why should a faithful person need to give anything up? But the specific example of Acts 15, they were not giving up the Torah and circumcision for themselves. They were giving that up in regard to others. And I think that's a crucial distinction. Just want to see if you would like to reflect on that.
I was offering a provocative question. Yes, sir. And then.
What is interesting in the Acts account was that the Jewish Christians were not asked to give up their belief in circumcision and the law and the keeping of the Torah, observing the Torah. But they were asked not to impose it on others who want to become part of the community. Because by trying to impose something very important for you, but on other people, you are destroying the possibility of a fellowship, of a one faith community. So that was a very specific question. For example, in the interfaith context, there are things that Christians have to give up in order to be in a relationship. For example, if we believe that in Jesus Christ we have found a way, fullness of life, salvation, etc., whatever you want to call it, there is no problem. But when you say this is the only way that everybody can, then you are overstepping your limit. You are now going into the freedom of religious life of the other. If you think that I have a precious message to witness to, all religious traditions have that urge to share what is, that is perfectly all right to be a witness. But if I go with the idea that I have an obligation to convert all these people to become part of mine, what is interesting is these are all non-biblical ways of understanding it. Or Jesus' way of understanding mission or understanding faith or anything like that. So over a period of time, ever since he became part of the colonial empire, ever since Constantine, so much imperialism and colonialism has seeped into Christian theology. That is the reason we are having problems. And much of this can be and should be given up in order to be able to relate to people of other religious traditions. All religious traditions have this extra thing that blocks them from relationship, that is not essential to their faith. And one of the tricks is to find out what these are and how we can overcome them.
Naomi, did you want to ask your question?
Naomi.
Thank you for saying that it was actually a provocative question, because now it makes more sense. And as I was talking to Ken earlier, I come from a very spiritual community. Everything is spiritualized, like basically everything. And in that mindset, I am supposed, because I was raised Christian, I am supposed to remain Christian for the rest of my life and never try to learn about other religion. It's dangerous. That's how spiritual we see things. But then growing up, when I came into college, I had to meet other people and explore other religion. And as much as we can see it as giving up something, I actually did not give up anything. In my experience, I've gained something. I've gained the skill of listening to others and understanding. And I don't regret it. I probably won't tell my priest and pastor back home, because they're going to spend the night fasting for my soul, because I might be lost. But God knows that I've gained so much more in just learning and trying to come into interfaith discussion with others. So to conclude what I'm saying, I would just say, what we see that as something is losing something. If it's actually gaining something, it's gaining understanding, and gaining also a skill of listening. And to me, it took me to give up on my fear and prejudice that I had from my very spiritual background. And yeah, so we're actually gaining, I think, than losing and compromising. And at the end of the day, we're probably just compromising little things. I'm not, by listening to other religion, I did not compromise my core values. I just accepted to listen, not thinking that my faith was the only thing. It's not, my values was not corrupted or destroyed. But yeah, that's what I have to say.
You added two. You added two.
So I'll offer what might be a minority report here, which is I would like to suggest I don't think I'm very concerned about an interfaith movement that says to other communities, this is what you need to do, or this is what you need to give up, or this is how you need to feel or think or theologize to be a part of this. Because for me, then it's no longer actually a genuine encounter with radical difference. So I'm not United Methodist, so if the United Methodist Church wants to have a conversation about how they develop their theology vis-a-vis other people, like that's a conversation that is interesting for me to look in on, but it's not a conversation that I'll participate in. But I will say, if the interfaith movement comes to the Jewish community and says, well, this is how you need to understand us and your worldview in order to participate, my response is F you, like get lost. I mean, so I'll tell you what I think. So I think, as I was saying yesterday, I'm not so naive to think that a lot of transformation happens stemming from interfaith encounter. And I think that's really interesting, and I think we should be self-aware about that, and self-aware about that in invitation to interfaith encounter. But I think the encounter itself cannot have those preconditions on it. I mean, and I think, as you were saying, I think if we define this in such a way that it's like, well, the door to entry is an acknowledgement that there's truth in all traditions, or that evangelism is wrong, or that any particular notion about the march yesterday or political prescriptions, then we sort of fall into the trap of the liberals who love everybody who think exactly like them. And I'll just say, a quick anecdote. I was at Allegheny College many years ago, and we were trying to organize an interfaith habitat build, and the intervarsity group didn't want to participate because they were opposed to interfaith work. And so I sat down, I met with them, and we're talking, and just trying to get to know each other. And they were like, look, we can't do interfaith work, but what we can do is go serve our community and then tell others about how Jesus motivates us to do that and witness, And I was like, great. I call that interfaith work. You don't want to call that interfaith work? That's fine, but you should come and participate in this. And they did. So I think we sometimes erect unnecessary barriers.
Thank you.
I say that this is what I'm hearing from everybody, and this is what, from my point of view, we must give up. We must give up intolerance and bigotry. We must give up prejudice,
I think you hit a nerve.
racism. We must give up the barriers that are keeping us from opening our eyes and seeing what else the world has to offer. I'm just taken by my table mate had to say, we have to seek those universal values. And we don't have to give up our core, what is our core belief. But if then our core belief tells us to shut our eyes to what the world has to offer, then of course there's something there that we need to think about. I was baptized a Catholic as an infant. I was raised a Methodist. In South Louisiana, all those religions kind of merge. It's not unusual to have those kind of combinations in our families. But I'm most inspired by Rumi, the Sufi mystic. And as I was listening to everybody, I'm thinking of one, of something that's in paraphrase as attributed to Rumi, who said that I looked for God in the mosque, and I couldn't find God there. I looked for God in the temple, I didn't find God there. I looked for God in the church, and I did not find God there, and I looked in my heart, and there I found God.
Thank you. Yes.
No, I wanted to ask you a question. Well, actually, I want to ask the students a question that I hope they end up responding to you. Because you were talking about you don't want to have prescriptions for interfaith. And I'm coming at it from a classroom educator, like in religious studies, and saying, well, there are rules to the classroom. There are conventions to the classroom. There are conventions for college camp, right? To be able to grade, I have to accept that there are certain rules that this is a paper and this is not a paper. That's why that's an F. Okay, so I'm thinking, maybe it's not about prescribing rules for interfaith encounter, but we do have regulative ideals or goals or rules or whatever for colleges. And so I want to ask the students who find themselves on campuses that are religiously affiliated that are not part of the tradition to which the campus is affiliated, do you find that the campus licenses, does the college license the students who try to convert you, if you are experiencing that?
You want to take that one?
I guess, are you asking, is there a permissive atmosphere for?
Yeah, where it's as if the campus itself is implicitly encouraging, even though they might not be explicitly evangelical, they are still saying we can accept or even encourage this kind of, like saying that evangelicals have a right to try to convert other people. It's like, yeah, but not in the classroom. And then as we get outside the classroom further,
okay. Thank you.
The campus complicit with that, even if they say they're not.
Any responses to that?
I do. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a student, too, and I'm from Emory and Henry College. And one of the questions that, sorry, because it really bugs me, is this accreditation issue, right? And this talk about, there are issues when we discuss that are like for student life and as a community. And then there are issues that what we do academically and as institutions. And a lot of those times, those questions are the same, and they interact with each other a lot of the times. And when we were talking about these biases that our college may have, one of the biggest ones that I see is in our religion department. That I have a religion degree, but when I talk about the classes that I've taken, I have a Christian ministries degree. I don't have a religion degree. And that's really, and so when we talk about realistic steps and also to talk about things that we have to give up, I'd like to suggest that we talk about things we're going to give up or we want to give up, because I also think that the way we phrase things has really a big value on how we're going to do them in the future. So I'd like to suggest that, the things that we want to do going forward. But what kind of role does GBHEM have? And to hear from Noah or from Carolyn to see how these things have happened in other institutions and non-sectarian schools, of what kind of role do we have in making applicable change to religion departments, so that when we come back as Methodist schools or Methodist deals, that we're all on the same page about what we're actually teaching our students. And I know that that's ooh, big picture, and maybe too far out of my deal, but the thing is that we've all got different campuses, and how do we make people want to come to a Methodist school when we're just making Methodist pastors in our religion department? I don't want in other schools, and there's another guy from a school who's doing great steps to make an interfaith program, and how do we make that something more of a collective thought going forward? Why do we want that to be more of a collective thought? So those are my things. I'd like to know more about applicable ways to make the religion department a core requirement and how we go forward about talking about interfaith change, not just student involvement and student work and campus life, but the actual academic thoughts, statistics, things that we do to make our schools more credible when we talk about this kind of deal. That's all.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that?
I'd like
Yes.
to say something.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So to answer your question and to kind of also touch on what you said, as a Hindu student at a Methodist affiliated institution, I think that, when I came to college, my family institution was challenged, but I think that the privilege of going to college in itself is being able to take charge of your education and what you are learning. And I think the role of the educator or the college professor or administrator in this setting is to create that space for constructive but respective conflict. So you are able to challenge your beliefs or strengthen your beliefs or gain. But is there a way to standardize that? I'm not sure, because why did I choose to go to Wesleyan versus another Methodist affiliated institution? You know, I think that is a question that's worth looking into.
Probably most of you know this story, and if you don't, maybe the three or so who haven't heard of it, I can kind of enlighten you on it, or otherwise, but just to let you know that at least a political scientist has heard this. You've all probably heard the story about the perfect church, right? Where there's a person who decides that his church isn't perfect. He's going to seek out the perfect church. He rejects others, and he goes everywhere around the world looking for the perfect church, and he just can't find it. One day he's going down a country road, and he sees this small chapel. He tries there, he stops, goes on in. There's only one person inside this church, and it's Jesus Christ. And he says, at last I found it. This is the perfect church, right? And Jesus Christ said, yes. He says, can I come into the perfect church? And Jesus says, well, yes, you can, but there's one issue, however. When you come inside this church, it won't be a perfect church anymore. Our colleges are not perfect. Our churches are not perfect. Our faculty is not perfect. Our students may not even be perfect. But what we got to focus on is what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? You know, we got to realize that we'll have mistakes. That'll be part of the process. We'll try and find a better way or redouble our efforts to try and get that. But we may not find a perfect church. Thanks.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Yeah. So if I can just respond to your question just from the IFYC perspective about conversion and religious affiliation of schools. We have a great privilege of working with tons of schools, lots and lots of different settings. And we have plenty of schools. So let me back up. One of the things that we've been working on are surveys of campus environments, so longitudinal and intersectional. And as part of those surveys, we look at what are people's experiences of the school? Are people having coercive experiences? Are people having negative experiences? Is it welcoming? And we then break it down and think about how are religious minority students, non-religious and religious majority students experiencing this differently. The big thing to say is it's context dependent. So that is widely different across the board. So I, in the last year, have been working with a school that is Roman Catholic, and at that school, non-religious students do feel a certain kind of exclusion and are really hesitant about coming out as non-religious. I'm also working with a Presbyterian school, has a strong Presbyterian identity, and they show that their students, religious minority and non-religious students, actually don't feel any different, don't have any difference in the coercion experiences or negative inner worldview engagement or pressure or welcome. So all that to say there's a big difference. The other thing to say is that we have lots of schools where it's religious students themselves who feel like they're not welcome. So, and who feel pressure to not say that they're religious. And that the secular worldview is itself a worldview, is itself a construction that is a product of the Enlightenment and does come back. I mean, so that itself is a construction. And so we're trying to negotiate, what does it look like to, how do we challenge the presumption that the non-religious is the norm, is the foundation, in light of the ways in which higher education in the US has developed, so. Oh. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, so we don't have as big of a survey for faculty, but we do on the team that I. Yep. We run a big survey for all faculty, staff, and administrators when we work comprehensively with a campus. The same. Not that sometimes on a campus it's the same as what students respond to, and sometimes it's different. But yeah. So yes, and longer conversation. I'm happy to talk about it. Yep. And I don't know if Noah has anything to add.
I think I'm going to go back to the original question, the provocative one, which says that, do you have to give up something of your faith when you're trying to be inclusive in teaching or inclusive in practice as a question. I think to answer that, every religion has to go back to their fundamental founding, I guess, practices by their prophets, including in Hinduism. You start with, say, a visual of an idol, right? And you grow yourself. The goal is you start with a certain steps of disciplined way of practice to orient your mind so that it doesn't distract and keeps repeating itself that you got to be nice, or you got to be this, or you got to be that. And then you're supposed to grow into the universal concept in application of those same fundamentals, which is secularism. You got to be secular in your basic faith, as Mark had originally pointed out, that just like when we grow up in body, we have to change our clothes size. So you are giving up the clothes that don't fit you into the clothes that fit you to your body's comfort. Same way in faith and religion. I always separate the two because religion is more a way of doing something, but spirituality is fundamentally the same in every religion or faith. So as you grow in your faith, as they say, there are no bounds how much you can love. There are no bounds how much you can do service. You grow to that universal level automatically, not realizing you've given up some of your original thoughts of this is my absolute truth. And your absolute truth, as you really learn your faith, grows. So you're not giving up, you're actually gaining more and more and being inclusive more and more while you don't give up your own basic fundamental ways like she does as a Muslim, or some Jewish people do, wearing their cap, but their belief grows in being more inclusive and universal in their practices.
Thank you. Noah, did you have something on?
So the first thing to say is Carolyn bet me last night about whether I could bring up the Enlightenment in this panel, and then she beat me to it, so I owe her a drink. My friend Rahuldeep Gill, who teaches at California Lutheran University, I think he's the only person in the country I know who had managed to finagle the title Interfaith Strategist. That's his title at California Lutheran. So he in this article he wrote, I think in the journal College Character, he talks about he was teaching a class and the various manifestations of diversity in the class and how he struggled to create what he calls a brave space. So he's sort of engaging this safe space, resilient space, brave space. And the point of the story is at the end of the class, after doing this for an entire semester, this one student and so all sorts of identities and traumas are coming out in this space. And at the end, this one student says, guys, I have to make a confession. I'm a Trump supporter. And the transgender African American woman says, it's okay, right? So I mean, I think what's my point? Yes, classroom, I mean, there's a particular conversation that I know you want to have, and maybe we should have it offline, about the particular role of the classroom and the regulatory ideals that govern that space, which also change over time, right? And it's an interesting conversation about who has the authority and the power to challenge those ideals and transform them and change them and whatnot. And there's a whole interesting thread to this that we could go down around the development of interfaith studies as either a bastard child or innovation or revolution within the academic study of religion, and how that's playing out in spaces like the AAR and other spaces within the academy, and so we could have that conversation. But I want to return to your point. There are folks who think that all religions are different paths up the same mountain. And there are folks who do not think that. Mm-hmm. And is it our job to convince them that they are wrong? And if so, what does it mean we are really doing that we are labeling interfaith work? And even these conversations about, well, what did the original intentions or what's in the Bible, or, I mean, there's a great story in the Talmud about how a bunch of rabbis were arguing about what this line of Torah means. And the one rabbi says, there's one rabbi who's in the minority position, and the rest of the rabbis have all sort of achieved some sort of consensus. And the minority rabbi says, well, if I'm right about God's intention, let that tree uproot itself, move 20 paces, and replant itself. And lo and behold, the tree does. The tree gets up and moves. And the other rabbis say, it doesn't matter. We're still right. And the minority rabbi says, if I'm right about God's intention, that, and fantastical thing after fantastical, and the end of the story is the community goes with what the majority opinion was. Because in the Jewish tradition, God gave Torah to the community, and it belongs to the community. So the point of the story is it doesn't matter what Moses meant, or it doesn't matter what God meant. It belongs to the community. So part of what I'm saying here is, like, I don't get the right to tell anybody else how their community wants to define who they are, what they believe, or the terms or conditions for engagement. I also think that bigotry and racism and systemic oppression, all these things are really bad things. And I think the challenge, hearkening back to part of what Ibu was saying on Friday night, the challenge is, how do you balance that? How do you balance trying to engage people in their radical and otherness, including holding beliefs that strike at the core of everything that I might hold to be true, and still holding those things to be true and engaging in that encounter? I think you were asking about, like, practical applications, and again, that's a whole other conversation. I'm not being as succinct. But the one thing I will say is, again, if interfaith work hadn't been started by Christians, would we presume that the primary mode of interfaith encounter was dialogue, or would it be something else? And maybe that is a path into negotiating some of these things.
I love that rabbinic story, by the way. What is it? Kol Hashmayim He, or something that is not in the heavens. So I want to come back to the idea of conversion. Real quickly, I did my PhD at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and took a class with Rabbi Goldman, and it turned out I was the only student in the class. Crazy circumstance, so I called it my Rabbi and I class. So we read rabbinic literature. It was literally Edward Goldman and myself, and we had an incredibly wonderful time. But there was one point in the class where he started talking about conversion to the Jewish faith, and suddenly I realized he's kind of putting out feelers for me. Like, why is this Christian, seminary student studying rabbinic literature? And I realized he was kind of fishing, and I suddenly thought, gosh, he wants me to become Jewish, or he's kind of checking me out, right? It's gentle as this is going to happen in a Reformed Jewish seminary. And so, but I thought, what a compliment. I mean, he wants me to be Jewish. I'd love that. I mean, no thanks, but no thanks. But still, I loved it. It was such a compliment. I mean, I took it as the highest praise. And then I remembered hearing another Jewish person saying, whenever a Christian talks to me about Jesus, I take it as a compliment. It's like, what's most important to them, they want to share with me, right? And no thanks, I don't want Jesus, but thank you for the offer, right? And it's just that approach that I think could be helpful for us to consider.
Yes.
My thoughts are kind of jumbled, so I'm going to try and construct a thought within the frame of this conversation. First, my name is Addison Saviors. I am a freshman religious education major with an interfaith studies minor at Oklahoma City University, and I'm also the intern at the School of Religion for interfaith programming and lectureships. So I come from a very interesting point of not only being a student, a religion major, an interfaith studies minor, a freshman, but also in the frame of being in the admissions as well and planning these events. And I want to go back to the question and conversation of talking about academics within interfaith work. And so it seems to me when we talk about interfaith work, we're talking about two things: social extracurricular interactions and academic work. And I really think that a great way to hone in this conversation and to kind of funnel in is to blend the two. So, for example, we were talking earlier about the differences at the university between a just religion degree, and my minor is interfaith studies minor. And so, for example, like religion, like you were talking about, you study the Bible, you study Methodist theology, you study how to preach, how to be a minister to youth, to children, but it's all in the framework of Christian education. Whereas my minor, we have peace and nonviolence. That could be for any theist or atheist. We have religious pluralism, which a friend of mine is in that class right now, and for their midterm, they did part of a social experiment and part of they went to a service of another faith, not from their own, and if they were of no faith, then they would pick one and assume the role. And for the midterm, they did part of a social experiment where they outwardly put on pieces of clothing from another religion. So one of my friends wore a hijab for a week, and that was part of an academic experiment and part of a social. And what she found was that administrators treated her differently when she was in that hijab. When she would go to the cafeteria, the lady who would swipe our card to let us in would not say, "Hi, good morning, how are you?" She would just look down and swipe and let her pass. And the next week when my friend returned without wearing the hijab, "Hello, good morning, how are you?" And it was that friendly encounter that she'd experienced before. And they talk about in the classroom how important that is in the frame of academia, and that alluded to diversity dialogue for faculty, staff, students, and like we talked about yesterday, how can RAs do that? How can people like biology professors or people like that intersect between the academic and the social? And I think also going back to the conversation of like creating the difference between creating Christian ministers and just people in interfaith work, it's not necessarily interfaith versus Christian ministers. It's not creating a but rather a blend, because I think that there's room, no matter in what religion or faith that you practice or don't practice, to be in interfaith work. But it really is helpful to blend the two, because when you see the blend of something that can be academic and social, it creates much more opportunities than you would by trying to keep them separate. So,
thank you very much. Yes.
I just wanted to comment on the religion department at Columbia College, because it's been a very positive experience for me. I'm 31 years old, getting my undergrad. I am a senior, but I took about a 10-year break, and when I did come back to college, I come from a family with no college history. Most of my siblings didn't even graduate high school, and so when I came into college, I knew that I wanted to get a degree in religion. And one of the first things my religion professor told me, because I was a child and family studies major and a religion major, and I told her I wanted to help families, she said, "You can't help families if all you know is Christianity. You have to know the cultures. You have to know the other religions. You have to know where people are coming from if you're going to be able to help them." So that was something that was emphasized from the very beginning in my studies in Columbia College. And I found that the religion degree, my official degree is religious, ethical, and cultural studies. It's all lumped into one degree, and there are history components mixed in with that. There are ethical components. Right now, I'm in a class that's focused primarily on the ethical studies of yoga. And I'm in another class that is studying the different schools of ethics. I've taken several cultural classes, history classes, and world religions classes where we study Hindu, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And when I first went into this religion degree, I was thinking, I'm going to know all there is to know about Christianity when I finish. And now that I'm nearing the end, I find that my studies of the ethics of yoga helps with my own spirituality and my own faithfulness, and my understandings of Islam and Judaism and Hindu and Buddhism also help when I am working on my child and family studies major and thinking about families as as units that may not come from our culture, may not experience religion the same as we do. And this interfaith work, I don't believe that the extracurricular religious experience are necessarily separate from those academic experiences. I think they very much overlap and coincide, and because of this, I think it's very important for colleges as institutions to support the institutions of the family, the institutions of religion, by combining these and making sure that these different life experiences, these very valuable life experiences, intersect on the college campus, and this learning and understanding and intersection, interfaith, continues once students leave campuses. And I know that Columbia College has been wonderful at providing that experience for myself. 4 years ago, I cannot tell you that I would be sitting here at an interfaith conference very open to the ideas of other religions being equally as valid as my own. And I think that colleges and institutions have a responsibility to spread that, to share that with others, that like it was said earlier, when you're learning about people of other faith, other cultures, other religions, you don't have to give up what you already hold in your heart. You're gaining, and that's a very valuable point in my education.
I think it has been a very interesting and very important conversation. And as for me, I both agree and disagree with Noah. Because at one level, there should be no conditions, no expectations of any community to give up anything in order to be in conversation. Because it is primarily an encounter between people. And as he had said yesterday, once you have had this conversation, you have met with the people in their otherness, you are never the same again. There is a change every time we meet. So even if people come with their baggages and their convictions, etc., but once they come and have an encounter, that itself is a benefit. It doesn't matter even what they talk about, but that they may encounter is itself a benefit. At that level, it is very true. When I was director of the Interfaith Dialogue Program, once there was a big problem between Muslims and Hindus, Fijians and Hindus in Fiji. There was a some Methodist youth went and set alight Hindu temple, and the Swami who ran the Hinduism Today asked what the WCC doing about it, etc. So anyway, we went on a team visit to Fiji to try to bring together the first ever interfaith meeting there of Christians who are Fijians, Hindus who are Indians, and Muslims who are also of Indian extraction. There was a Wahhabi Muslim in that group who insisted on distributing pamphlets about Islam and wanting to talk. That's why I'm here. And it brought the whole thing to a stop. Because there are certain, what you said about the classroom, there are certain rules about you don't have to accept the other, but you must respect the other. But once you say that everybody must listen to read my pamphlet, whether it is a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist Islamist, then the conversation stops. Now, we are also with such a negative experience in a slightly different way with the Jewish community when WCC tries to enter into dialogue with Judaism. The Orthodox Jewish community says theology is out. The questions of justice or peace or anything as far as the Middle East is out. If it is a part of the conversation, we are not coming. So we had to go for non-Orthodox Jewish people to talk. Therefore, it is possible that there are things that primarily militate against a spirit of dialogue and some of the basic principles that you need to be in dialogue. And therefore, at one level, there are things that we must give up. And as far as I am concerned, I never say what other religions must give up. I talk with Hindus who have untouchability and Dalit problem and all that, I will talk. But I talk to my Christians, I say, there are certain things you must give up if you want to be in a dialogue. So that is a discipline that some of us must learn in our own religious traditions. But in spite of all that, I also agree with Noah that there is a case for bringing people together irrespective of what they believe. Of course, that's a different kind of getting together. Agenda is different, and it has its own benefit. But it must be nuanced. What we talk about need a little more nuancing.
I'd also like to come to Noah's defense. Not really, because, but yes.
I agree and disagree with myself anyway, so it's fine.
Right. In that, as I spoke earlier about giving things up, I think that oftentimes that is said from a point also of Christian privilege, and non-fear of assimilation into a culture that will take things away, and then you lose your identity entirely. So one thing that has clarified, sort of this balancing act between giving up and then respecting the core beliefs and sort of identity markers of any other group has been through interfaith advocacy. I find myself as an advocate for interfaith in the role that I play with student organizations as an advisor. And so I'll give you a good, quick case study. I'm the advisor for Vanderbilt's Muslim Student Association, and we have made tremendous strides in convincing dining services, for example, to have halal food every single day and not just 2 days a week, that sort of thing. But the one project that we worked on that took over a year to accomplish was to get women's only swimming in the recreation center. And it was a night, not that the university was against the idea, but it was just a logistics nightmare. And so after about a year, we figured it out, and the university decided to extend its operating hours on Sunday afternoon beyond 5 o'clock, and the rec center would be closed down except for women coming to swim. So as I was talking with our Muslim Student Association and with the women in particular, I was saying, now, is this is for women? This is for any women, right? Oh yes, you don't have to be Muslim. It's just women only. I said good. So that was a question that was put to me, and a question that I was also entertaining. But then the question got raised by the dean of students to me: what if a person identifies as female? And so I said, I don't know. I know what I think, but this isn't my question. And so I went to the MSA and I asked the question, and they were very clear. They said, if the reassignment is 100% complete, then absolutely. If not, then the answer is no. And so I go back to the dean, and that's the answer, and he says that's not acceptable. And so my role as an advocate is, on one hand, I do share the dean's worldview in terms of, for me, that's not an issue. Let everybody swim as they like. But as an advocate for the MSA, I had to oppose him and say, I don't agree. Luckily, this is a hypothetical problem and not a real problem at this point. But if it ever does become a real problem, I will actually have to put myself on the line and say, I don't agree with this decision for the university to force the MSA to allow someone who identifies as female, even though that really represents my own belief system. So I don't want to force them to give something up, even though I'm trying to open up accessibility to all. So.
You see yourself as an advocate for the MSA students and not the LGBTQ students?
Yeah, right.
As a representative of the institution, you have to represent all students.
Well, the thing is, I don't think it's a win-lose proposition. I would just ask the rec center to then open up 2 hours for transgendered students. I would try to find a compromise, but I'm not going to force this decision on the MSA. And that's not a comfortable place for me to be. I'm just saying it's a lonely job to be an advocate.
But you're not forcing the institution. Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's the point at which, but I'm not just, at that point, I go from being a messenger to a prophet, I guess. I'm working the other side of the street at that point.
I know we've been sort of returning back to your sort of comments about, like, I don't have the right to tell other people, and that's part of what we're talking about. And you're talking about giving things up and do I have the right? And I really appreciate your comments around the way you actually work with people. And I had jotted down in my notes, thinking about Martin Buber and sort of notion of IU, right, and sort of seeing people as an end in themselves rather than as a means to an end, that encounters are going to be inevitable. So certainly within my own personal space, I've got to decide how is it that I'm going to encounter other people. That's a decision I can probably only make for myself. But you raised the question of, these all sound like bureaucratic questions to me. What are the regulatory ideals? Who has the authority, right? By what process do we resolve disputes? And the question is disputes about what? And you've just given us a really nice case study, I think, around, well, here's a dispute. How to resolve it. To go back to the comment I made earlier, which institutions do we go to resolve some of those disputes? For disputes about the meaning or sort of purpose of our religious identities and sort of what those might be, we might go to our religious institutions. For questions about how to do education, what education looks like, we might go to our education institutions, right? And I've talked about families, when we talk about how we sort of think about how to raise our kids, which was a question you asked us yesterday. We lost control of that. How do we sort of do that? How is that regulated? How does that happen? What are the ideals by which we're supposed to act? I have two other institutions that keep cropping up for us that also seem important, and that is democratic institutions. At the end of the day, if we lost faith in our democratic institutions, because you said if someone were to come to you and say, I'm going to try to convert you, right, you'd say, F you, I believe was your specific thing. You'd resist that.
I'll let you finish and then I'll clarify.
I would share your sort of, if someone came to me to try to convert me and thought they could force me to do it, I would turn to democratic institutions to say, in fact, our democratic context doesn't allow you to force me to do those things. So we can turn to other regulatory bodies to try to prevent that from happening, depending on the pressure of the moment. Right? But I'm wondering, and I'm new to this. This is a new space for me. Thanks for letting me be here. This is a new kind of conversation. But I'm wondering if we're starting to describe another kind of institution, and that is interfaith institutions and interfaith alliances that have their own regulatory processes, their own questions about how our work is to be done, and how do we turn to those institutions and those organizations to help make that happen. That goes back to your question, like, should the United Methodist Church be fostering this? Like, well, to what extent is it partnered with other kinds of institutions who might have other objectives and other goals, but where their interests align, right? And where they might be in cahoots with one another. All right, so I guess I want to invoke those other two institutions. And that's part of what you're up to in your story. It's a beautiful case study of that. Who has the final say here? And by who's the arbiter? And what are the values and what are the disputes about? And who do we turn to sort of close the matter?
So Dr. Raja, as I said, I agree and disagree with myself too. So that's fun. But well, so first of all, it is a wonderful story, and you must have told that to someone at IFYC at some point because we use it all the time, and I think it actually appears in a chapter unattributed.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, so it's a great case study. I think to your point, and I think this also gets to Ken's point about interfaith institutions. I think what I'm trying to say is if we're talking about interfaith work in the abstract aggregate, I want to be very adamant that we can't make rules about who comes in or what you have to believe to come in. But in any individual instance of an interfaith encounter, to your point, you absolutely need regulatory ideals. You need to be able to say, in this space, this is what we're doing, this is what's off limits, this is what's not, and so, and part of what I think in an ideal world happens is you create some space to say, okay, in this initial encounter, we're not passing judgment on your evangelism or your proselytizing or your beliefs about the final status of Jerusalem or LGBT issues or anything else. We're doing this one thing here, and then that builds a relationship that then is strong enough to support some of these harder, thornier issues. So yes, I mean, interfaith dialogues or encounters that IFYC facilitates, especially introductory ones, we do say, like, this is not a space for proselytization. That's not to say that can't be an important part of your identity or that you can't believe in it wholeheartedly, but St. Francis said, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. So, that there are different ways in which you can engage it in this space, and then there's a broader totality to who you are and to the interfaith movement. I want to say that. I also want to clarify the gentleman in the back. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. I mean, this was my own personal transformation. I lived in Morocco for a long time, and I finally realized that all the people on the street who were trying to convert me, that it was a gift, that it was an act of generosity. And I was like, okay, that's great. Like, thank you. I like our relationship is at the point where you care about my soul. That's good. My question is always, what happens after I say no? Like, that's what I'm interested in, right? So what happens after I say no? Do we still, and in the North American context, do our kids still, and this gets to democratic or civic institutions, do our kids still go to the same schools? Do we still participate in PTAs together? Do we still believe, do I still accept, to Ibu's point, do I still accept the person that you vote into office as my president? Do I still abide by the rules that are made under this legislature, et cetera, et cetera? So I think, I lost my train of thought, but I think, I'm not saying that other people shouldn't try and convert me, because part of what I'm saying is I recognize that's a part of who other people are. But I'm saying don't come to my community, and this also gets to your point about different institutions, and tell the Jewish community or any other community I'm part of, here are the rules that I came up with for how you get to participate in this broader thing that we're doing here. And if you don't abide by those rules, then you don't get to come participate. I think the democratic project, I think the civic project, and I think, again, to Ibu's point, this is what's under existential threat right now, is we have to somehow figure out how to maintain these macro institutions of a democratic society and reconcile with the fact that we believe fundamentally different things about the thing on the issues that we care most deeply about. And if we set the rules of, this is the circle, and if you're outside of it, you don't get to participate, I don't think we go very far.
Remember Eva's example yesterday. He not only says, like, because he closed it by complicating it for us to say, but I am right.
Yeah.
But I am correct in these things. And so the inclination there is that in those examples, let's take a specific case around gun control or other legislation, or access to abortion. We might have fundamental differences from our faith traditions about whether we think that's right or not. But if we try to enact that into law, we turn to our legal institutions to try to regulate that or decide whether that's going to pass or not.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to answer the question that was raised earlier before this starts. My name is EE. I'm from Wesleyan College. Before I start try to answer the question, I like to talk about the definition of what I believe is an interfaith. Well, I believe that interfaith or interracial, it could go both ways, is that to build tolerance and understanding between a group of people in an imagined community. I believe so. It could be as large as a country, or as small as a army unit, a school, or at work, where people share the common interest, common duty or goal, and learn to coexist together peacefully. So the question that was raised earlier by this gentleman over there was that should all the schools, do schools still have to follow the hegemony, which is the founding religion, and should all the schools should be interfaith? So I think like Patel talk on Friday night, he mentioned about the book called Should Hegemony Exist in Democracy? Well, I like to change it to this: should hegemony exist in interfaith? Because I like to talk about my friend. When she was interning in Malaysia, which is a predominantly Muslim country, when it was the time for the Ramadan, they were all eating, all the non-Muslim people have to eat lunch. But they were very understanding of how non-Muslims have to eat lunch, and they did not say anything about it. In fact, they encouraged the non-Muslims to eat lunch because they do not have lunchrooms or other rooms to eat, so they just did it in the in the room that they were working. So like I said, we got hegemony, which is the founding religions of the institutions. I'm not sure about the new institutions, whether they have the founding religion, but then, like one of the panelists said yesterday, the hegemony is that the majority, is that the religion the majority follow? Like, because one of the panelists said that even though she works in a Methodist college, majority of the students there are not. Or is the hegemony the founding religion of the college? But then, if hegemony can lead us start coexistence, then I believe that it could lead us to more tolerance for the interfaith. So I think that having a hegemony is not necessarily a bad thing. So this is what I want to talk, yeah.
Thank you very much. Any replies to that comment? Sure.
So while I agree, it's okay, obviously that in lots of spaces there's going to be a community that dominates, in most interfaith dialogue or most types of things, it's always, for example, the Methodist community, this is a Methodist place, so I think if that's kind of what you mean by hegemony, that kind of like, the people that are running the space. But in the actual interfaith work, you can't have a hegemony of thought because that's just an oxymoron. How can you have interfaith work when, in the interfaith dialogue itself, one thing is dominating? So I think, this place is a perfect example of, one tradition is running this, but there's lots of different perspectives.
Any other thoughts? Well, we're at come on.
Well, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
So, is your comment saying, I'm sorry, I forget your name now. Are you saying in an institution where like interfaith starts to become promoted, that interfaith itself could become hegemonic? Or is it that the religious institution, that founds the college kind of is complicit with, okay, so the way I'm thinking about it is that there's a college that is religiously affiliated, and there may be a majority of students who are either non-identifying with the affiliated or they are identifying, and in student life there may be a hegemony, like there's way more Christian student groups than there are other student groups. And so there is just dominance, literally, in terms of numbers. For me, the issue is faculty, administrators, and staff, are they complicit with and facilitating that hegemony, or are they actively looking for ways to temper that such that it's possible that interfaith could start to happen? Because as long as there's this kind of atmosphere of just, it's obvious that there aren't others here, who's responsible then to like help go, well, wait, they might not actually be here right now, but they're out there and we could be, I don't know if I'm even responding to your comment.
Thank you. So we're at a time now where we need to shift to bringing our whole conference to a close because my agenda says that that's what I told you we would do. The question, I didn't wake up at 2 a.m., Noah, but it was more like 4:51 because I looked at the clock, was on the question that you posed about, are we talking about interfaith practices or interfaith leadership? And that led down the rabbit trails of what are practices and what is leadership, and then what is interfaith, which led to Foucault and Wittgenstein, and a very interesting devotional morning for me. It seems, from my perspective, that we're a polarized people. And we're polarized on a number of different lines, on political, cultural, demographic, and religious lines. But we And there are institutions and people whose identity is bound up with making those lines more distinct, driving wedges deeper in between people. And the reasons for doing so are power, money, position. So we've gathered together probably as people who are already at a point where we don't demonize the other as our first principle. We've moved beyond that. But are we also, when we're talking about these interfaith conversations, are we also giving people the skills that they need in order to overcome the conflict that has been created? Are we doing things like peace building and reconciliation? Because it seems to me, from my hegemonic, white male, ordained Christian, Methodist, bureaucratic perspective, where, quite honestly, I can get on an airplane here and land nearly anywhere else in this world and not have to struggle. How can I engage in these conversations from my position to open up the possibilities for others to have voices, for the voice of people like me to diminish to the point where it is one voice among many voices? We have to be, and the word that keeps coming up in my mind is people like me have to be decolonized. We have to become aware of the privileges that we have received and know what they are and work intentionally to make them less powerful. So when I think about my own faith journey, to put it that way, a lot like Mark said he grew up, he was a fundamentalist Christian. Mine was more charismatic. The church we attended would be identified more in a Pentecostal vein, very charismatic. You know, there are spiritual gifts that you would demonstrate as evidence of your salvation. And this was one of my first instances of spiritual awakening when I was told by the pastor there that my failure to speak in tongues was a sign that I was not saved. The first thought that ran through my mind was, I'm all right with that. If that's all it means to have this faith, that you can speak in tongues, and I by no means don't hear me say that that is not an authentic religious experience for people. But if the goal of the faith that he was trying to teach was that only I would do that as evidence that God loves me, then I didn't want any part of that. That was my first kind of spiritual awakening to the fact that not everyone believes the same way. And it's not entirely necessary. It's not at all necessary that we all believe the same way. I really don't have a direction that I'm going when I'm trying to wrap up some of what I've heard over the last couple days. But we are at an intersection here, and we actually had the title of the book, Intersections, where there are different faith voices from different faith perspectives coming together to share our stories, to share our experiences in hopes of developing, I think, deeper understanding of who the other is, so that we each can be more present in the world in which we live. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing to do. And it's a transformative thing to do. we've talked about United Methodists. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the hegemony of being in a United Methodist-owned building with United Methodist signs everywhere. And it was even mentioned in here, I think Laura read it, about the mission of the United Methodist Church is to create disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I've been with Methodists, and we've sat around and like, what does that transformation mean? Well, it means different things for different Methodists, I think. And you might know that United Methodists ourselves are becoming very practiced at not being united. We're very good at dividing. And if you read about United Methodists in the news, and we've been in the New York Times about how divided the United Methodists are, which is some irony there. We're not learning how to live peaceably with one another. In fact, we're learning the opposite, how to be better at dividing ourselves. So from my perspective and my position, what we're aligning our office to do is to work with whatever organizations and whatever people in whatever places we can find to create opportunities for people to grow as human beings and be well in doing so. And we're coming at this from the United Methodist faith perspective, but it's not, we're not trying to change your heart to be a Methodist Christian, but rather to change your heart so that you might live peacefully in the world and be peaceful with yourself and peaceful with others. I would ask, does anyone have any kind of things that they need to say before we close our time today?
If I could say a couple things, actually.
Yes,
real
please.
Quick. So I didn't respond to the previous question because I don't really have a lot of interesting contribution to make as far as the interaction between institutions, but perhaps on the scale of interpersonal interaction. The vast majority of interfaith communication that I participate in, if it counts as interfaith communication, is between believer and non-believer, or between theist and atheist. And one thing that I've had to learn that you have to give up, or you have to be willing to give up, at least in my case, is confidence and conviction with certain questions that I used to think I had answers to. And so I think, I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is, but you said towards the beginning of the conversation over the last question that ignorance and bigotry, you made those two, or referenced those two terms. And I think those are most dangerous when they're coupled to confidence and conviction. An ignorant person, I think, is not nearly as dangerous as an ignorant person who's confident. And so that's something that I've had to give up, actually, quite a lot. And it tends to manifest in terms of communication where the question is over not only what is it you believe, but why is it that you believe what you believe. So, for example, a question I get a lot from theists is, especially in the context of evangelism, is well, if you don't believe that a God exists, then why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Or where did the universe come from? And the way it manifests the having to give up confidence or conviction is that sometimes I don't know is the only correct answer, or at least it's the only honest answer that I can give, rather than saying, here's the answer that's, simple, takes care of that question really easily. And so that's the first thing is just being willing to step back and recognize that sometimes I don't know is the only honest answer we can give to a difficult question, even if we're tempted to give an answer that we've been taught or an answer that we've grown up with. And then the other thing to the issue of division and polarization, I guess this is somewhat a serendipitous occasion being able to talk about this, because just a week ago I gave a workshop at another conference on the subject of the evolution of tribalism. And I'm very, very much concerned with the issue of polarization and tribalism and, Inuit versus Eskimo. But I'm also a biologist, and so I'm coming at it from the perspective of biology and trying to explore this question as a matter of how our species has evolved. And that's, because my area of personal research is genetics, this has kind of forced me to kind of step outside of my comfort zone as far as my research expertise and try to read a lot of the social science literature. And one thing I came across was that there's mounting evidence in favor of the conclusion that simply being organized into groups, even on completely arbitrary, completely superficial criteria, is enough to promote discrimination, in-group, out-group thinking. There's a social scientist that passed away a few decades ago. His name was Henry Tajfel, and he was a Holocaust survivor, and he was a Polish Jew who was born, I believe, in 1919, and he joined the French army, was quickly captured by the Nazis, and because he never denied being Jewish, but because he was a soldier fighting against the Nazis, he was sent rather to instead of a concentration camp, he was sent to a prisoner of war camp. And after the war, he found out that he had lost all of his family and most of his friends. And he dedicated his life to going into social psychology research and exploring the question of, what is it that causes intergroup conflict. And he performed a study where he took school-aged youth, like eighth and ninth grade, I believe it was, and organized them into groups on completely superficial grounds, just completely arbitrary, and then forced them to participate in a task where they could award basically financial rewards to the other kids in the study, and they didn't know the identity of the other kids. They only knew whether or not the other kids belonged to their group or not. And it was amazing that the only phenomenon that rivaled fairness was maximal differentiation, maximal in-group versus out-group distinction. And then it goes the other way as well, where what's being found in the social psychology literature also is that simply awareness or simple concern for this in-group, out-group, tribalistic discrimination is enough to mitigate it in a lot of cases. And so, like, for example, what you brought up about, just having a Christian that you say hi to and that you're friendly to is enough to kind of force them to humanize you a little bit, and that's something that that we can all make a practice of doing is forcing exposure and interaction between ourselves and people we don't agree with, and it makes it a lot more inconvenient for those prejudices to continue to thrive if you serve as a counterexample to the negative stereotypes that people ascribe to you. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I just think that this is what you just said was just a great ending. Earlier, Rita said that we had attempts to convert through evangelism to avoid conflict, and that so that people have used conversion in their own faith to go out in the world and to try to make everybody else like them so that they can avoid conflict. But I had this light bulb just went off as I was thinking I was going to run out so I could get my flight out. But but I had to say this, that I think that you put the icing on the cake and turned this whole thing around in terms of why intersections, why interfaith. Because you said that we have interfaith for peace in the world, not to avoid conflict, not to make everybody like us, but for peace in the world, and that's the great transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. I do know there are people who have flights they would like to catch, and folks who have drives ahead of them with an hour on the already added to your time. Mark Hanshaw, who is our Associate General Secretary in the Division of Higher Education, and that's the division that's been supporting this event. I had to leave early, in fact, to catch a flight to head back to Texas. He asked me to thank each and every one of you for your participation and presence here. It's been a very valuable time and experience. I also want to point to the folks in the back there. That's Sarah Bollinger right there on the far right. We work together on a project that's just brand new called the Wellbeing on Campus Initiative. So that's something we're working on. And then Amanda Allen right there is the Director of Schools, Colleges, and Universities. The question about the accreditation and the regulative aspects of the degrees in religion, you really should just go ask her. She's just anxious to answer that question. And then kind of right there behind the camera is Steffi Meisner, who is our program coordinator in the Office of Collegiate Ministry. And thank you to the three of them for helping with all the bits and pieces. And also our ever fabulous GNTV, the production crew, they just make things wonderful. So thank you. We will have our conversation available on video. We've captured all of it. So we'll have that available in some kind of way if you want to access it in the future. Thank you to those of you who came up here on the panel this morning, especially just coming over for the day to have conversation with. I'm really grateful to each one of you for your participation this morning. I'm getting a paper waved at me. There's a piece of paper on your table. It's a kind of a basic feedback form. If you have thoughts and feelings, you may fill that out. And there's a basket back there right in between Sarah and Amanda. You can put it in there. Does anyone have any other kind of things that would be good for all to know? All right, thank you so much. Please get more copies of those books. They are for you. Again, if you didn't get a copy of the Intersections volume and want one, see me and I'll get your name and address and have it shipped to you. Tim is holding up a book called The Prophetic Voice in Making Peace, which is a collection of essays that I edited and through a colloquy that we did 2 or 3 years ago at Syracuse. And there are chapters in there on interfaith and interreligious engagement, including a chapter by Tim and a chapter by Mark Forrester in that book. So that's available on Amazon, and you can get it there. Anything else for the good of all? My gratitude goes to each of you for being here, and I'm extraordinarily grateful that you gave your time for this project. So thank you very much. Safe travels to you.